Welcome, dear listeners, to another bone-chilling episode of Unveiling Nightmares. I'm your host, C.A. Bainham, and today we have a special guest with us. Guest today is none other than Christopher Bevard, author of The Mystery of Lullabies, Junkman, and many more titles. Hello, Christopher, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Great.
So just tell me a little about yourself.
So I've been, as you said, I've been a horror writer for quite a long time, roughly 30 years or so. Huge horror fan of every facet of the genre. It's kind of been hardwired into me since I was a kid. So it's right. This was probably a natural, the natural result of everything I've taken in over the course of my life. You know, my being a horror writer.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I mean, I started when I was very young. I think my first book was The Exorcist. I think that was the first
That's a good one to start with. I don't know what my first one actually would have been. God, that's a good question. I wish I did know. I started reading at a really young age. My parents got me reading very early. So, I mean, comic books and things like that. But I moved pretty quickly into novels and things like that. I was kind of a precocious kid. But yeah, God, I wish I could remember what my first one was.
No, I think mine was a bit of a rebellion thing because my mum said I was not allowed to read Exorcist at all, and I kind of snuck it out of the library and read it. So yeah, that was my first one.
Telling a kid they're not supposed to read something like that, the first thing they're going to do is go find it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me a bit about your writing and your books.
Sure. So, I mean, I think in terms of kind of where I started with everything. Like I said, I started writing, I would say I started writing seriously when I was probably 18 or 19. I'd kind of always tinkered with it, when I was younger, when I was in high school and even younger than that. I grew up, my kind of childhood influences, I guess. I mean, they were obviously, I'm kind of a product of the late 70s, early 80s. So I was right smack in the middle of kind of the golden age, that horror boom during that period where there was just horror everywhere. It was fantastic. But I grew up, like I said, reading and writing from a really early age. I was really into Ray Bradbury when I was a kid. Obviously, that never changed. He's amazing. I was always really, really into comics. So EC Comics and Pacific Comics, Twisted Tales, all of that stuff, Creepshow. All of those things were a tremendous influence on me as a kid, and I think got me really interested in the idea of actually writing stories and hey, this is something I could actually do, right? Yeah. And I think so when I got serious about it, it was kind of it worked out in terms of timing, because at that time in the mid to late 90s, there was a real influx of it was kind of the dawning days of e-commerce, right? And there was a huge movement at the time, a lot of zines and a lot of independently produced published horror, a lot of really great stuff by authors who are still doing it in many cases. And some of the stories that are in my latest collection, as you mentioned, The Mystery of Lullabies, some of the stories that are in that are actually stories from that era that were published in a variety of long out of print horror zines. And part of my goal with putting that out was to get some of those back in print. But that's really what kind of got me going. It was, in terms of kind of the evolution of it, it worked out nicely because I had all of that influence to draw from when I was young, just because of the time period. And then by the time I actually sat down and said, okay, I want to do this, I had the outlet and the means by which to do it, so I just never stopped.
That's good. Okay. So, sorry. What's the biggest influences on your work, or who is the biggest influences?
I would say, if I had to cite a single influence in terms of novels, in terms of writing, counting out comic books and movies and that sort of a thing, because all of that stuff I think kind of plays, I kind of think of all those things as being in kind of the same pot, right? I mean, I don't think of it as, that's, you can't be influenced by movies as a writer. Of course you can. And like I said, EC Comics were a huge thing for me when I was a kid. Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, and the impact that EC had on me as a kid, as far as kind of learning how horror stories could be structured and kind of seeing the way that they did it, I couldn't overstate how important that was. Yeah. I would say if I had to pick a single author that influenced me when I really started out writing and kind of taking it seriously, it'd probably be Michael McDowell. he just, it's still for me, McDowell just absolutely blows my mind. I can't believe how good he was at setting just absolutely terrifying scenes. And I've read The Elementals probably 100 times, and every single time I read it, it still has that same oomph. You know what I mean? He was a master at it, and it's one of those things where I know he's very respected amongst a lot of hardcore horror fans and indie writers and stuff like that. But the world at large has no idea how important that guy was, and yeah, I would say if I had to cite one person, it would be him.
Right. It's a good example, to be fair. Okay, so can you share some insights into your creative process and any rituals that you've got?
As far as I don't know about any sort of like preparation I do or anything like that. I saw Rob Zombie recently live, and I was joking with a friend of mine that the visuals and everything that was happening on stage looks like the way the inside of my head looks all the time. I'm kind of just I'm kind of always living it. You know what I mean? It's just horror is such a huge part of my life. If I'm awake, I'm ready to go. So I wouldn't say there's anything specific that I do in terms of preparation. I think the most important thing for me is having gotten to a point over the years where, any idea that I have, jot it down. Don't overanalyze. Don't think about whether or not it's been done before. Don't try to figure out, hey, how am I going to do that? What form would it take? Doesn't matter. If there's an idea that sounds like it might be worth playing around with, write it down, come back to it later. And doing that, I can go back and look at a million different places where I could potentially start a story. Right. So I kind of always have something brewing. Just depending on how many projects I have at a given time, that sort of a thing. So I wouldn't say there's anything specific I do to prepare for an individual piece of writing per se. It's more just about kind of playing around with ideas and realizing when I'm onto something that looks like it's going to become, really, really turn into something.
Yeah. I had a conversation with another author, P.K. Baker, and she said that she was a little bit worried that her book was being referred to as similar as the film Skeleton Key. But I said, like all the ideas that are out there nowadays, they're similar ideas, but each author has a unique perspective to add to that. So it makes it different. So I guess there's a lot out there that are quite similar at the moment, but as I said,
yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah.
So I was just told that there's a different perspective on things if you've got your own unique take on it. So that's what you do. You put your own unique take, and it becomes one unique story again.
Absolutely. And the thing I think a lot of times, when I talk to, because I'm an English teacher also. So a lot of times when I talk to, people who want to write or things like that, or just, other writers through the years, that idea comes up a lot. Obviously the idea of, is what I'm doing, wholly original or whatever it is. And I would say to that, it's wholly original is almost impossible if you're talking about genre fiction, because if you're talking about genre fiction, you're talking about a very specific set of parameters under which you're working, right? But yeah, like you said, and I think a really important thing as a writer, that a place that you want to get to in terms of being comfortable with your style and developing kind of your own take on things, is to not, overanalyze that. Your style is going to be what your style is going to be.
Yeah.
Right. And you can fight against that all you want, but ultimately, if you're going to make progress and you're actually going to get through something, right, whether it's a novel or a short story or whatever it is, you just kind of have to start going. You know what I mean? And once you do that, you're naturally your own take on it's already forming. It's already happening. You don't have to sit down and think about doing that, right?
That's right.
And I think a lot of people miss that. They don't think of it that way.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, so crafting horror and extreme horror, as you probably know, can be an intense journey. So what challenges have you faced in the genre, and how do you overcome them to create the unsettling experiences that your readers have?
That's a really good question. I think for me, the most successful horror is always rooted in some element of realism, right? I think Excuse me. One of the things that one of the earliest influences I think on me was Dawn of the Dead, as far as movies go, and reason being, I mean, obviously, it's a everyone, Dawn of the Dead, everyone loves Dawn of the Dead. It's one of those movies kind of everyone agrees on. But the opening sequence in Dawn of the Dead I saw when I was probably 12, when they're in the TV station, and then it moves to the tenement building where the military is, declaring martial law. And it seemed so real to me. And it scared me because of how real it seemed. And there was no moment where I had to suspend disbelief. You know what I mean? It was just like, this is happening 100%, no question. And this is how people are reacting. And that was what really scared me. It could have been anything. It could have been, it's zombies. It could have been anything in that context, and it would have scared me because it was presented in such a realistic context. And I think if you're going to have, this is just for me, obviously everyone has their own take. But if you're going to build out scenes that really stick with people, and if you're going to build out a horror narrative that really sticks with people, there has to be an element of it that they can really grab a hold of as being something tangible and realistic.
Yeah.
Whether it's a situation that someone's in or whatever it is. Right. So for me, when I think about anything, any horror narrative, regardless of even if I know where I'm going to go with it yet, I'm thinking about what's a context that's not going to seem unusual to people, or is not just going to seem completely over the top right out of the box, right? What's something that everyone can pick up the book and be like, oh yeah, I did that the other day, or this sounds like somebody I know. And then, 20 pages later, everything's going haywire, right? But I think for me, it's about rooting it in some realistic context that makes the more extreme the situation becomes, then the more potentially upsetting it becomes for the reader, right? So that's kind of what I try to do. Right.
So can you provide us with any insights to reactions or experiences from the readers?
I was really interested to think about that, because it's not, I have to say, I haven't interfaced with a lot of readers, not for any particular reason, just because, I don't have a lot of people reaching out to me. They're more than welcome to. I just haven't had it happen. I've talked to readers at horror cons. I've talked to, readers on an individual basis periodically. Somebody did compare my novel Junkman to as if Clive Barker wrote a story that was set in the Midwest. I was like, all right, I'll take that. That's kind of a small town Midwestern take on, I don't see any similarities in terms of the story to anything that Barker did, but I think that's a nice, I'll take that compliment. I don't know. I would love to know, honestly, what more. I think a lot of times people are kind of reticent to really throw their actual opinion on the table. I'm open to whatever reactions people have. I'm certainly not looking just for, to have my ego stroked. I've spoken to people periodically at cons and stuff like that who enjoyed what they had read of mine, but in terms of specific insights that I've gotten from people about kind of the development of it or something like that, I don't know that I haven't gotten a lot on that front. Hopefully people are liking it, if they're, hopefully they're not staying quiet because they don't like me.
Or you scare them.
That would be fine. If that's the reason, I'd be flattered by that.
Okay, so can you tease any upcoming projects or work in progress?
Yeah, I have actually. So this has been a very busy year for me. I have a lot of projects that have all been, it's kind of funny. They've all been kind of simmering for several years, and a whole bunch of things are about to kind of hit all at once, just because that's kind of how it timed out. So earlier this year, I released, like I said, The Mystery of Lullabies, which is my most recent short story collection. I also write crime and detective fiction. So I also earlier in the year released a novel called Nothing to Kill or Die For. Yeah. And that's the second in a series of books I have about a Chicago PI named Ethan March. Those are kind of noir-esque crime novels set in Chicago. So both of those have actually come out this year. And I do have I have another horror novel in the works that I'm hoping, if all goes well, hoping I can have out next summer. And I don't know that I can speak too much to that quite yet, but I do have, in terms of writing, I have a couple of podcasts that are going to be launching in October. The first one is called 15 Minutes in Hell. And it's basically going to be a roundtable style discussion of iconic scenes or favorite scenes in horror films between me and a guest. We're going to have, directors, actors, other writers. It's going to be a lot of fun. And I've got some really, really cool guests lined up for that, I think. The second podcast is called Cicatrix, and it's a long form serialized horror story in episodes that will premiere in October and then continue into the spring before we break for a second season. But that's something I've been working on as far as a writing project for a very long time. And it's a tremendous amount of writing, as you can imagine. Yeah. Because it's kind of a monologue style episodic podcast. But both of those podcasts will be released through my my media company, Sensory Eclipse. And I sent you the link for that. In addition to that, this November, I also have a tabletop game company that it's been in the works for quite a while, called Midnight Parlor Puzzles and Novelties. And we're focusing entirely on board games and escape room style games with a horror bent. So there are a lot of kind of companies out there like that. I'm a huge puzzle enthusiast, borderline obsessive, into cryptology and stuff like that. But there aren't any companies out there really that are doing solely horror. You know what I mean? Just original narrative horror games. And that's what we're shooting for with Midnight Parlor. So our first Kickstarter for that is actually going to launch in November. And it's a kind of a multi-chapter horror puzzle adventure. But we're really, really excited about that. And I wrote all the content for that, and I wrote the story behind that and everything. So a lot of writing projects that I've kind of been juggling for a long time are kind of all coming down at one time. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. That sounds really exciting. I shall look out for those.
Thank you. Yeah.
So can you share your vision for the evolution of this chilling genre? I mean, where do you think extreme horror is going to go?
It's I think the great thing about it is that we don't know. You know what I mean? I think, horror is one of those genres that it's always been there. It will always be there. It's never going to go away. It's gone through ebbs and flows in terms of mass media popularity over the decades, but the whole genre is rooted in human psychology, right? I mean, we're hardwired to try and cope with things that we find upsetting, you know what I mean, or frightening or whatever it is, and that's not going to change. Obviously, that's always going to be there. So I don't think storytelling built around that will ever change either, right? And I think it's going to adapt as it always has. I mean, and like you said earlier, I mean, there are always going to be new voices that kind of are tasked with building on what came before, and that's going to be the real challenge. Is you look at the 80s when someone like Clive Barker came around, and I mean, that was such a watershed moment for horror because nobody had ever done what he was doing at the time. But now, you've got generations of people who are influenced by that and taking in all of whatever cultural things have happened to them since, right? Yeah. And synthesizing that into who knows what, right? I mean, look at all the things that have happened probably the last 20 to 30 years that you could build on from a realism perspective and turn into some sort of extreme horror. So I think what's cool is that what we're starting to see now is people who are my age, kind of children of that era, are the ones kind of driving the car now in a lot of cases, right? They're, now they're the ones running movie studios and things like that. So I don't think, I have no fear whatsoever that it's going to go anywhere. I would imagine, over time it will, everyone's definition of extreme is different, but certainly there's a lot to work with, given kind of where the world has gone. So I don't know. I don't know specifically where I think it's headed, but I think it's certainly headed to places that we're not yet ready for.
Yeah, I mean, there's no limitations, is there, with extreme horror, so it can go anywhere.
Exactly.
That's brilliant. Well, a heartfelt thank you to you for sharing your nightmarish insights and allowing us a glimpse into the author behind your books.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
That's no problem. So all links to Christopher's books will be in the description below, and as always, my links will also be. So is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap things up?
I just want to say thank you to everyone listening. I want to say thank you to anybody who ever picks up either my book or anybody else who's an indie author. I mean, I always tell my writing students, nobody sits down to write a book by accident. Everyone does it for a reason. No author sits down without a why, right? So, I'm grateful that I'm able to do this, and I'm more than grateful for anybody who ever picks up one of my books. I hope you enjoy it, and, I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Stay tuned, dear listeners, for more spine-tingling tales and dark discussions in a world of extreme horror. Until next time, remember the nightmares are real, and here on Unveiling Nightmares, we're crafting nightmares one tale at a time.